March 28, 1945, 6:14 a.m. An American artillery shell screams through the cold Bavarian morning and detonates directly inside a German command post on the eastern edge of Aschaffenburg. The explosion tears the roof off a 3-story building, sends burning timber spinning 40 feet into the air, and kills 6 Wehrmacht soldiers before they can finish their morning coffee. The concussion wave shatters every window on the block. A burning map of the city's defensive positions flutters down into the rubble like a dead bird. And somewhere, in the smoke and dust, a German general looks at what's left of his headquarters, brushes the debris from his uniform, and says 4 words that will set off one of the most violent, costly, and unnecessary battles of the entire European war. He says, "We do not surrender." His name was General Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer, and what George S. Patton said to him 6 days later, in a room that smelled like diesel fuel and cold fury, would haunt the German general for the rest of his life. But to understand why Patton's words hit so hard, you have to understand what was happening in the spring of 1945. You have to understand how insane the world had become. Because by March of that year, the Third Reich was not losing the war. It had already lost it. Everyone knew. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall. The only question was how many more men would die before the last German commander finally admitted what every private, every cook, every frightened 15-year-old conscript already understood in his bones. The answer, in too many places, was all of them. The numbers are staggering when you actually stop and look at them. By early 1945, Germany had lost over 4 million soldiers killed in action. 4 million. The Soviet Union was grinding through East Prussia like a meat machine. The British and Americans had punched through the Siegfried Line in the west. Entire German army groups were being encircled and destroyed. Cities were falling. Supply lines had collapsed. The Luftwaffe was essentially gone. The German Navy was bottled up. And yet, from his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was issuing orders as if none of this was real. He was pointing at maps with divisions that no longer existed. He was signing execution orders for generals who retreated without permission. He was declaring random towns and cities to be Festungen, fortress cities, to be defended to the last man, last bullet, last breath. And some German commanders, men who had given their entire lives to the Wehrmacht, men who had survived the Eastern Front and Stalingrad and years of brutal combat, still followed those orders. Not because they believed Germany could win, but because obedience was all they had left. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing that everything they had sacrificed, every atrocity they had participated in or looked away from, had been for absolutely nothing. Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer was one of those men. He was not a cartoon villain. He was not a raving fanatic. He was a professional soldier, 51 years old, born in Munich, the son of a factory manager. He had joined the Reichswehr in the 1920s, back when Germany was still rebuilding after the humiliation of the First World War. He had worked his way up through the ranks the hard way, through competence and discipline, and the kind of iron personal will that military institutions reward and civilians find terrifying. He had served on the Eastern Front for nearly 3 years. He had commanded units in conditions that defied description. Minus 40 degrees. Enemy artillery that never stopped. Supply drops that never came. He had watched thousands of his men die in the snow outside Stalingrad. And he had not broken. He had held his sector. He had followed his orders. And that was the problem. Because the man who could hold a frozen trench line against the Red Army through sheer force of will was also the man who could look at a burning Bavarian city in the spring of 1945, with American tanks surrounding him on every side and no possible hope of relief or escape, and still choose to fight. Not out of hope, not out of strategy, out of something older and darker, out of the terrible momentum of a life spent never, ever giving up. When Hitler's orders arrived, declaring Aschaffenburg a festum, Kramer accepted them without hesitation. The city was strategically valuable. It sat on the main river in Bavaria, controlling bridge crossings, rail lines, and highway junctions that Patton's Third Army desperately needed to continue its drive east. Kramer understood the military logic. He also understood that holding the city was almost certainly impossible. But impossible had never stopped him before. He went to work. In the days before the Americans arrived, Kramer transformed Aschaffenburg into a killing ground. He positioned machine gun nests in the upper floors of the city's medieval buildings, giving his gunners overlapping fields of fire down the narrow cobblestone streets. He ordered his engineers to mine every bridge approach and booby-trap the most obvious infantry routes. He placed snipers in church steeples and factory towers. He organized his roughly 3,000 defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht regulars, Waffen-SS troops, and terrified Volkssturm militia that included men in their 60s and boys who had been students 2 weeks earlier, into a layered defensive system designed to make every block cost the Americans blood. He issued one standing order: no surrender. Any German soldier who attempted to lay down his arms would be shot by the SS security troops positioned behind the main defensive line. He was not bluffing. 2 Wehrmacht privates who attempted to slip out of the city on the night of March 26th were caught, court-martialed in a proceeding that lasted 11 minutes, and hanged from a lamppost on the main square by dawn. On March 25, 1945, the forward elements of the American 45th Infantry Division, part of Patton's unstoppable Third Army, reached the outskirts of Aschaffenburg. The Americans were tired but confident. They had been moving fast, sometimes 30 miles a day, punching through German resistance that crumbled almost everywhere they touched it. Most German cities at this stage of the war surrendered before a shot was fired. The commanders would meet an American officer under a white flag, exchange some papers, and that was it. Done. Everyone went home alive. The officer commanding the American advance sent a patrol forward under a white flag to offer Aschaffenburg the same deal. Kramer's response was delivered by a German officer who stood at rigid attention and spoke in precise, formal German, while an American interpreter translated in real time. The garrison of Aschaffenburg will not surrender. The Führer has ordered the defense of this city to the last man. Any American soldier who enters this city will be killed. If your commander wants Aschaffenburg, tell him to come and take it himself, and tell him he will pay for it in blood. The American patrol returned to their lines in silence. The message traveled up the chain of command until it reached the man it was always going to reach: George Smith Patton, Jr., General of the United States Third Army, 60 years old, 3 stars on each shoulder, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, and more controlled aggression per square inch than almost any human being who had ever put on a uniform. Patton was at his forward headquarters when the message arrived. An aide who was present described the moment. Patton read the report. His face went very still. Then, slowly, the corners of his mouth turned upward. Not a warm smile, the kind of smile a man gets when something he has been waiting for finally arrives. Patton said, quietly, that they had a German who wanted to die for Hitler, and that it would be his pleasure to accommodate the request. Then he got to work. Within hours, Patton had diverted additional artillery battalions to the Aschaffenburg sector. He called in air support. He ordered additional infantry and armor to completely surround the city, sealing every possible escape route. He was not simply going to attack Aschaffenburg. He was going to obliterate it. He was going to make it an example so devastating that every other German commander with orders to hold a Festung would look at the photographs and choose a different path. He told his staff he wanted the city reduced to rubble. He also told them he wanted General Kramer brought to him alive. He had things he wanted to say. The battle began in full on March 28, 1945, at 06:14 hours, when the first American artillery salvo turned Kramer's forward command post into a crater. From the beginning, it was a different kind of fight than anything the Americans had encountered since crossing the Rhine. German resistance was not symbolic. It was not desperate last-stand posturing that collapsed under real pressure. It was organized, disciplined, and lethal. Kramer's machine gun positions caught the first American infantry units in carefully prepared kill zones. American soldiers moving up what looked like clear streets suddenly found themselves under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Men died in doorways, in intersections, in the narrow lanes between ancient stone buildings. The Americans adapted. They stopped using the streets. They blasted holes through the interior walls of buildings, moving from room to room through the stone itself rather than exposing themselves outside. They learned to throw grenades into every space before entering it. They learned to treat every doorway, every window, every dark corner as a potential death trap. They moved in small teams, covering each other constantly, never assuming a building was clear just because they had passed through it once. Progress was measured in meters. A morning's worth of fighting might gain half a city block. Then German counterattacks would push them back again. Then the whole brutal calculus would repeat itself. The medieval streets of Aschaffenburg, streets that had stood for 700 years, were being ground into powder. Baroque facades collapsed into the roadway. Church towers that had survived the 30 Years' War came down in clouds of dust and smoke. The civilian population, thousands of German women and children and elderly people who had nowhere to go, huddled in their cellars while the city above them burned and shook. Patton visited the front lines on the 3rd day, as he always did. He drove through the shattered streets in his Jeep, his face set with the flat, controlled expression of a man who has seen worse and intends to see worse still before this is finished. He stopped to speak with a young private being carried back from the fighting, a bandage soaking through on his left arm, his face white with shock and blood loss. The private asked why the Germans wouldn't just quit. Didn't they know the war was over? Patton looked at the burning city for a moment. Then he looked at the soldier. He said that some men would rather die than admit they were wrong, and that it was their job to help them with that. By the 5th day, Kramer's defense was fracturing from the inside. His ammunition was running critically low. Food had essentially stopped. The SS security troops were still shooting men who tried to surrender, but the executions were becoming harder to enforce as the defensive perimeter shrank and unit cohesion collapsed. German soldiers were surrendering in small groups, emerging from the rubble with their hands raised and tears running down their faces, willing to risk the SS rather than face another hour of the American assault. An eyewitness account later described seeing a boy, 15 years old, conscripted into the Volkssturm just days before the battle began, shot by an SS sergeant for crying and begging to go home. The Battle of Aschaffenburg cost the Americans over 400 casualties in 6 days. including more than 80 killed. German losses were catastrophically higher. Over 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The city, one of the most beautifully preserved medieval cities in Bavaria, was devastated. Entire neighborhoods that had survived intact for centuries were gone. On April 3, 1945, the last German position in Aschaffenburg fell. Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer was captured, trying to escape through the sewer system beneath the city. He was filthy, exhausted, and alone. His staff was dead or captured. His garrison had been destroyed. His Festung had lasted 6 days. It had accomplished nothing except the deaths of hundreds of men and the destruction of a priceless city. He was brought before the American divisional commander, who informed him that General Patton wished to see him personally. Kramer straightened his torn uniform. He was still a German general. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing up. He was driven to Patton's headquarters and walked into the room where George Patton was sitting behind a desk covered in maps, 3 stars on his shoulders, ivory revolvers on his hips, and the coldest eyes Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer had ever looked into. Patton did not stand. He did not offer a seat. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply stared at the German general with an expression that went beyond contempt into something almost clinical. The look a surgeon gives a problem he is about to correct. Then Patton spoke. What he said next would stay with Kramer for the remaining 26 years of his life, and would be repeated in the debriefings, the histories, and the memoirs of every officer who was present in that room. But before we get to those words, you need to understand something about George Patton that most people miss. Because what made Patton different from every other general on either side of that war was not his aggression. It was not his speed, or his tactical brilliance, or his physical fearlessness, or even his famous revolvers. It was something simpler and more devastating. Patton understood, with perfect clarity, the difference between courage and waste. Between fighting for something and dying for nothing. Between a soldier and a fool. And standing in front of him was the clearest example of the second thing he had ever seen. In Part 2, Patton delivers the words that broke Kramer's professional identity in half. We go inside the room, inside the exchange, and inside Patton's own diary entry, written that same night, where he describes what he really thought of the man who refused to surrender and exactly what kind of legacy a general like that leaves behind. And then we follow Patton east, into the final weeks of the war, where an even larger confrontation is building, one that will involve not hundreds of lives, but hundreds of thousands, and a decision that Patton's commanders will make over his furious objections that may have changed the entire shape of the post-war world. 6 days. That's all it took for George Patton to destroy everything Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer had spent 30 years building. 6 days of artillery, fire, and American infantry grinding through medieval stone streets to reduce a Festung to rubble, and a German general to a filthy, exhausted man crawling through sewers beneath a burning city. In Part 1, we watched Kramer refuse the impossible and pay for it with everything he had. We left him being walked into Patton's headquarters, straightening a torn uniform, trying to hold on to the last thing he had left, his dignity. Now we find out what Patton actually said to him, and then we follow what happened next. Because here is the number that almost no one talks about when they tell this story. In the final 6 weeks of the European War, after Aschaffenburg, at least 47 other German garrison commanders received the same Festung orders Kramer received. 47 cities, 47 opportunities for the same massacre to repeat itself. What Patton did with Kramer's defeat, and what he said in that room, would determine how many of those 47 chose differently. Patton did not offer Kramer a chair. He sat behind his map-covered desk and looked at the German general for a long time, without speaking. The room smelled like diesel and cigarette smoke, and the particular dry cold of a Bavarian spring morning. Outside, somewhere in the distance, artillery was still firing. The war was still happening. It would not stop for this conversation. When Patton finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made it worse. He said, "General Kramer, I've been looking forward to this." Kramer said nothing. He stood at attention. His uniform was caked with sewer grime. There was dried blood on his left sleeve from a shell fragment he had not bothered to have dressed. He was 51 years old, and he looked 70. Patton leaned back in his chair. "I've killed a lot of Germans in this war, thousands of them. And I'll tell you something I've noticed. Most of them died fighting for something real. Their families, their country, their comrades. Even the ones fighting for a bad cause, at least they had a cause." He paused. "But your men, what did your men die for?" Kramer's jaw tightened. He did not answer. "A city that was going to fall anyway," Patton said. "Orders from a man hiding in a hole in Berlin who hasn't seen the front lines in 3 years. You spent 6 days killing Germans and Americans both, destroying one of the most beautiful cities in Bavaria, for a result that was mathematically inevitable on day 1. Patton stood up. He walked around the desk slowly, the way a man walks when he has made a decision, and there is no reason to hurry anymore. He stopped 2 feet from Kramer. "I respect a brave enemy. I have always respected a brave enemy. But I do not respect a fool. And General, what you did in that city was the act of a fool." Kramer's eyes did not move. He stared at the wall behind Patton's shoulder with the fixed emptiness of a man who has decided not to feel anything. Patton stepped closer. His voice dropped. "You knew. You knew it was over. Every man in your garrison knew it was over. The privates knew it. The boys you conscripted from their classrooms knew it. And you still sent them into those streets." He held the silence for 3 full seconds. "That's not courage, Kramer. That's cowardice dressed up in a uniform." It was the word cowardice that finally moved something in Kramer's face. A muscle in his cheek. A brief tightening around the eyes. Then nothing again. Patton walked back to his desk. He sat down. He picked up a report and looked at it as if Kramer had already ceased to exist. "Get him out of my sight," he said. "Process him through standard channels." Kramer was led from the room. He would spend the next 4 years in Allied prisoner of war camps. He would be released in 1949. He would live until 1971 in a small apartment in Munich, working briefly as a logistics consultant for a manufacturing firm, before retiring into complete obscurity. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews. He died alone, and according to the 2 people who knew him in his final years, he never once spoke about Aschaffenburg. Patton wrote about the meeting that same night in his diary. His entry was 11 sentences long. The last line read, "Told him what I thought. He had nothing to say. None of them ever do." But Patton was already thinking about something larger than one stubborn German general in a ruined city. He was thinking about the 47 other Festung orders still in effect across Bavaria and central Germany. He was thinking about the roads his tanks needed, and the bridges that would be blown if those garrisons fought. He was thinking about men, his men, being fed into medieval streets that looked exactly like Aschaffenburg streets, one city block at a time. He made a decision. He would turn Aschaffenburg into a weapon. Within 48 hours of Kramer's capture, Patton's psychological operations teams were printing leaflets. Not propaganda in the traditional sense. No heroic imagery, no slogans. Just photographs. Black and white photographs of what was left of Aschaffenburg's main square. The collapsed church. The shattered facades of buildings that had stood since the 14th century. The rubble piled 6 feet deep in streets that had been cobblestone market lanes 3 weeks earlier. And one line of text beneath each photograph, printed in clean German. This is what happens when you follow orders that cannot be obeyed. The leaflets were dropped by aircraft over 11 German cities in the following week. The results were not immediate. The first test came at Schweinfurt, a city of similar strategic importance, with similar Festung orders, and a garrison commander named Colonel Ernst Weber, who had received the leaflets and reportedly read them 3 times before his American counterpart's messenger arrived. Weber met the messenger personally. He asked 2 questions. He wanted to know if American forces would guarantee the safety of the civilian population. He wanted to know if his men would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The American messenger said yes to both. Weber surrendered Schweinfurt without a single shot fired. His garrison of 1,800 men walked out of the city with their hands up on the morning of April 6, 1945, 3 days after Aschaffenburg fell. 1,800 men. 0 American casualties. 0 German casualties. The bridges intact. The roads open. Patton's tanks were rolling through Schweinfurt streets by noon. When Patton received the report, he read it at his desk, set it down, and said nothing for a moment. Then he told his aide to send a commendation to the psychological operations team. He said, "That leaflet just saved more lives than a regiment of infantry." But Patton was fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, and the second front was inside his own chain of command. Because while Patton was turning Aschaffenburg into a psychological operations template, his superiors at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were making decisions about the final weeks of the war that were going to affect everything. Decisions about which cities to take, which to bypass, and most critically, how far east to push before stopping and letting the Soviets have the territory their Red Army was bleeding to capture. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, had made a strategic decision that Patton considered the single greatest military and political error of the entire war. Eisenhower was going to stop the American advance well short of Berlin. He was going to let the Soviets take the German capital. Patton was incandescent. He argued the point in every meeting, every briefing, every corridor conversation he could get. He told anyone who would listen, and many who would not, that the American army was the most powerful offensive force in the history of warfare, that it was moving at a speed no military force had ever achieved in a theater this large, and that stopping it for political reasons while the enemy was still in the field was not strategy. It was surrender of a different kind. He said that every mile they gave to the Soviets now was a mile that would be fought over again in 20 years. He said that the map being drawn in the spring of 1945 was the map that would define the next half-century of European history. He was right. He was also completely unable to change anything. Eisenhower's decision stood. The political agreements made at Yalta in February had already divided post-war Europe on paper, and the Supreme Commander was not going to violate those agreements with a unilateral armored thrust that might trigger a direct confrontation with the Red Army. The war was nearly won. The endgame was being managed by men in rooms far from the front lines. Men who were thinking about what came after victory as much as how to achieve it. Patton was given his operational boundaries and told to stay inside them. He complied, because that was what a soldier did. But in his diary, his language became ferocious. He wrote that they were handing the Soviets a gift that would cost the free world everything. He wrote that his tanks could reach Prague in 48 hours, and Berlin in a week. He wrote that he was being asked to watch from a distance while history made a catastrophic mistake, and that his hands were tied by decisions made by men who had never once ridden in a tank through enemy fire. And here is where the story of Patton, and the story of what Aschaffenburg really meant, becomes something bigger than one battle and one stubborn German general. Because Patton understood, with a clarity that few of his contemporaries shared, that wars are not just about the fighting. They are about what the fighting makes possible afterward. Every city surrendered intact was a city that could be used. Every bridge saved was a bridge that could carry something other than tanks once the shooting stopped. Every German commander who chose Weber's path instead of Kramer's path was a man who had preserved something that could be rebuilt. And every mile of European territory that American forces did not take in the spring of 1945 was a mile that would sit behind an iron curtain for the next 44 years. Patton saw it all. He said it out loud. And no one who had the authority to act on it listened. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. He was 63 years old. The news reached Patton's headquarters that evening. By the next morning, the implications were already reverberating through every level of Allied command. A new president, Harry Truman, a man who had been vice president for 82 days and had never been told about the Manhattan Project, was now making decisions about how to end the deadliest war in human history. And somewhere in the Pacific, the war that had no end in sight was about to produce a moment that would make Aschaffenburg look like a neighborhood dispute. Because 13,500 sailors, 36 ships, 480 aircraft, all of it gone in 20 minutes in the waters north of the Philippines. One engagement, one decision, one question that no one in any government on earth had yet figured out how to answer. How do you end a war against an enemy who genuinely believes that dying is preferable to surrender? Patton thought he knew the answer. He had just demonstrated it in a burning Bavarian city with photographs and leaflets and 11 sentences in a prisoner's face. In Part 1, we watched General Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer turn a doomed Bavarian city into a 6-day slaughterhouse and lose everything. In Part 2, we heard what Patton said to his face and watched Patton transform that defeat into a psychological weapon, dropping photographs of rubble over 11 German cities to make the next 47 garrison commanders think twice before choosing Kramer's path. Schweinfurt surrendered without a shot. The leaflets worked. The war in Europe was accelerating toward its end, but Patton had also warned us, in his diary and in every heated meeting at SHAEF headquarters, that the decisions being made about where to stop were mistakes that would echo for generations. And somewhere in the Pacific, a number was waiting. 13,500 sailors, 36 ships, 480 aircraft, erased in 20 minutes. That number was not a cliffhanger. It was a question. And in the spring of 1945, nobody had an answer. Now, we find out what happened when the question became impossible to avoid. By the second week of April 1945, German military intelligence had fully documented what Patton's psychological operations campaign had accomplished. The after-action reports captured by American forces in subsequent weeks revealed the scope of the panic it created inside the Wehrmacht's collapsing command structure. In the 14 days following Aschaffenburg's fall, at least 19 garrison commanders who had received Festung orders sent urgent requests to Army Group headquarters asking for clarification on whether the no-surrender directive was still in force. 19 out of 47. 40% of the men who had been told to die in place were now looking for a way out before the Americans arrived. The German High Command's response was immediate and furious. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel issued a supplementary directive on April 9, 1945, reminding all garrison commanders that the penalty for unauthorized surrender was death, and that their families could face consequences under the Nazi regime's system of collective punishment. He explicitly referenced the leaflets. He called them enemy psychological terrorism. He ordered all copies destroyed on sight and threatened courts-martial for any officer found in possession of one. It did not work, because the photographs had already been seen. The image of Aschaffenburg's main square, reduced to chest-high rubble, had already been burned into the memory of every German officer who had looked at it for more than 3 seconds. You cannot unsee a cathedral turned into a gravel pile. You cannot unsee the burned-out shells of apartment buildings where families had lived. Keitel's directive told commanders what they already knew about the penalty for surrender. The photographs told them something Keitel could not counter: what the penalty for resistance actually looked like on the ground. German tactical intelligence also identified something more troubling than the leaflets. They had begun tracking a pattern in Patton's operational tempo that defied conventional military logic. His Third Army was not slowing down. Most armies at this stage of an extended campaign show measurable deceleration caused by supply strain, equipment attrition, and troop fatigue. Patton's army was accelerating. Between April 1st and April 15th, Third Army units captured more territory per day than in any comparable 2-week period since the breakout from Normandy. They were moving through Bavaria like water finding downhill channels, bypassing resistance where it was pointless to engage, concentrating overwhelming force where it mattered, and processing surrendered cities so efficiently that the administrative machinery of occupation was set up and running within hours of the last German unit laying down its arms. Wehrmacht intelligence officers used one word repeatedly in their assessments during this period: unaufhaltsam, unstoppable. But Patton's momentum was about to collide with something that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. The problem was not German, it was American. And it did not arrive in a battlefield dispatch. It arrived in a political decision made 600 miles away from the front lines. Eisenhower's boundary orders for Patton's Third Army placed a hard stop on eastward advance at the Czech border. Patton had known this was coming. He had argued against it for weeks. But knowing something is coming does not make it easier to accept when it arrives. On April 16th, Patton received formal operational orders confirming that Third Army would not advance beyond its designated stop line. Prague, a city whose liberation would carry enormous symbolic and strategic weight in determining post-war Central Europe's political alignment, was 36 hours away from Patton's lead tanks. 36 hours. The Czech resistance was already fighting in the streets. Soviet forces were more than 72 hours out. Patton called his superior, General Omar Bradley, and made the argument one final time. He said he could take Prague. He said the roads were open. He said his supply lines could support the advance. He said the Czechs were begging for American forces to arrive first. He said every day of delay was a day the map of post-war Europe shifted further in the wrong direction. Bradley told him no. The decision came from above both of them. Patton hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment. Then he told his aide to get him the latest operational maps for the territory he was actually authorized to take. He was done arguing. There was still work to do inside the lines he had been given, and he was going to do it with everything he had. What followed was the most concentrated offensive action of Patton's entire career. April 18, 1945. The Bavarian town of Regensburg, population 41,000. A Festung garrison of approximately 2,200 Wehrmacht and SS troops under the command of Colonel Adalbert Trautner, a career infantry officer who had served in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. Trautner had received both the Festung orders and the Patton leaflets within 12 hours of each other. He had read both. He had called his staff officers together and shown them the photographs of Aschaffenburg. He had asked them a single question. He asked whether any of them believed the outcome here would be different. None of them answered. Trautner sent his reply to the American advance units at 700 hours. He would surrender Regensburg under the conditions of the Geneva Convention. His garrison would lay down arms at 0900. The bridges would not be destroyed. The civilian population had been informed and would remain in their homes. American infantry entered Regensburg at 0907 hours. 2,200 German soldiers stood in formation in the main square, with their weapons stacked neatly in piles beside them, arranged by type, rifles in one stack, machine guns in another, as if they were returning from a training exercise rather than ending a war. The bridges over the Danube were intact. The medieval old city, one of the best preserved in Germany, was untouched. Not a single building damaged. Not a single civilian casualty. Not a single American soldier killed. Patton received the report at his headquarters and said nothing for almost a minute. Then he told the officer who had delivered it that Trautner was a smarter man than Kramer, and that smart men in charge of cities tended to mean those cities survived, and that the world needed cities more than it needed dead colonels. He wrote 2 lines in his diary that night. Regensburg today. Intact. The photographs did their work. But the real test was not Regensburg. The real test was happening on the other side of the planet, and it was a test that Patton's photographs and Patton's words and Patton's entire philosophy of war could not address. Because the enemy in the Pacific had already absorbed everything that made Kramer's logic catastrophic, and had built a military culture around it, deliberately. The Japanese Imperial Armed Forces, in the spring of 1945, were not fighting the way Germany was fighting. Germany's problem in the final months was commanders who clung to orders because they lacked the moral courage to accept defeat. Japan's problem was categorically different. Japan was not clinging to orders. Japan was clinging to a belief system. The concept of Gyokusai, honorable death in battle rather than surrender, was not enforced by SS men with pistols positioned behind the defensive line. It was internalized. It was theological. Japanese soldiers did not need to be threatened with execution for attempting to surrender, because the idea of surrender had been removed from their psychological framework entirely. This was the number. This was what 13,500 sailors meant. The Battle of the East China Sea, April 7, 1945. The Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed warship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded, armed with 9 18-inch guns, capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small automobile, 26 miles. Sortied from the Japanese home islands with a task force of 9 ships, on a one-way mission. They carried fuel for the outbound voyage only, no fuel for a return trip. The plan was to beach the Yamato on Okinawa and use her as an unsinkable gun battery until she was destroyed. Every man aboard knew they were not coming back. American carrier aircraft found them at 12:32 hours. The attack lasted 2 hours and 1 minute. 386 aircraft from Task Force 58 hit the Yamato with at least 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes. The ship capsized and detonated when her magazines exploded at 14:23 hours. The explosion was visible from 60 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 4 miles into the sky. Of the Yamato's crew of 2,733 men, 2,598 were killed. 135 survived. The men who died were not coerced. They were not threatened. They chose it. That is the wall that Patton's entire philosophy, brilliant as it was, could not scale. You can show a German colonel photographs of rubble and change his calculation, because he is making a calculation. You cannot change the calculation of a man who has already decided that the calculation does not matter. American military planners looking at the casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, were working with numbers that made Aschaffenburg's 400 casualties look like a rounding error. The low-end estimate for American dead in a home islands invasion was 250,000. The high-end estimate exceeded 1 million. Japanese military and civilian casualties were projected in the millions. Some estimates suggested Japan could lose 10% of its total population in the fighting. Patton understood this. He understood it clearly and without sentimentality. He had demonstrated in Bavaria that you could end a war faster by making the cost of resistance viscerally obvious to the commanders who had to order it. He had saved lives with photographs. He had opened roads with 11 sentences spoken to a filthy general in a torn uniform. He had moved faster and killed fewer people than any other approach would have allowed. But the Pacific was not Bavaria. And the question of how to end a war against an enemy who did not share your framework for what made a life worth saving was a question that leaflets could not answer. By May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European war was over. Patton stood in his headquarters in Bavaria and felt, by his own account, as if someone had pulled the floor out from under him. He was a warrior without a war. He immediately lobbied to be transferred to the Pacific Theater. He wanted to be there for the end. He wanted to be part of whatever came next. He would get his wish, though not in the way he imagined. And the man who had saved Regensburg's bridges and destroyed Aschaffenburg's garrison and spoken 11 sentences that haunted a German general for 26 years was about to face the strangest chapter of his career. Not a battle, not a campaign, something quieter and in some ways more damaging than either. The question of what to do with George Patton when there was no more enemy left to fight. In Part 4, we follow that question to its answer. We look at what happened to Patton in the months after victory, at the decisions he made and the words he said that his superiors could not overlook, and at the final entry in his diary, written 11 days before a car accident in Heidelberg ended his life at 60 years old. And we ask the question that his story has been building toward from the moment he smiled at that first refusal to surrender. What is the cost of being right? We have come a long way together. 4 parts, 4 hours, from a German general crawling through sewers beneath a burning city, to Patton sitting behind a desk delivering 11 sentences that would haunt a man for 26 years. From photographs of rubble dropped over 11 cities, to Regensburg's bridges standing intact, and 2,200 German soldiers stacking their rifles in neat piles in a medieval square. From the unstoppable momentum of the Third Army grinding through Bavaria, to the impossible arithmetic of the Pacific, where an enemy had built a culture around dying and called it honor. The question we ended Part 3 with was not tactical, it was personal. What happens to a man like George Patton when the war he was built for is finally over? What happens when the most ferocious offensive weapon in American military history has no more targets? The answer is one of the most uncomfortable stories in the entire history of the Second World War. And it begins not with a battle, but with a press conference. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Patton was given command of the Third Army's occupation zone in Bavaria, one of the most historically significant regions of the former Reich. His job was no longer to destroy. It was to govern, to rebuild, to manage, to be patient and diplomatic and politically careful in a way that everything in his nature made almost physically impossible. He lasted 4 months before he destroyed his own career with a single sentence. In September 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tölz, a reporter asked Patton about his policy of allowing former Nazi Party members to hold administrative positions in the occupation government. Patton had been doing this pragmatically, on the grounds that the former Nazis were often the only people with the administrative experience to keep essential services running. He thought it was a practical decision. He said so. And then he went further. He said that the Nazi Party membership issue was not unlike a Democrat and Republican political situation in the United States. That the Nazis were just another political party. The room went silent. The quote was on the wires within hours. By the next morning, it was in every newspaper in America. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army 10 days later. He was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing the history of the war, with no troops and no operational role. It was the military equivalent of being put in a corner and told not to speak. Patton accepted the reassignment without public complaint. In private, his diary entries from this period are the most raw and honest writing he ever produced. He wrote that he felt like a horse that had been put out to pasture while it could still run. He wrote that he did not understand the politics and did not want to. He wrote that he had spent 30 years learning how to break things and was now being asked to explain why he was not better at building them. He wrote that he missed the war, not the dying, not the destruction, the clarity, the certainty of purpose that combat provided and peacetime never could. On December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was involved in a collision with a military truck on a road near Mannheim, Germany. The accident was low speed. No one else in either vehicle was seriously hurt. But Patton was thrown forward and struck his head against the glass partition separating the front and rear seats. The impact fractured his third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was 60 years old. He died in a military hospital in Heidelberg on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident. He never recovered movement or feeling below his shoulders. He spent his final days dictating letters and receiving visitors, lucid and characteristically direct until nearly the end. His wife Beatrice was with him. He told her that the manner of his death was appropriate because a soldier ought not to live long enough to explain his victories. He was buried at his own request with his men, not in a private family plot, not in a national cemetery reserved for generals and presidents. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery at Hamm, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He lies there today, at the head of the rows, among 22,000 of the men he commanded, in the country they helped liberate. Friedrich-Wilhelm Kramer outlived him by 26 years. But the ideas Patton had demonstrated in those final weeks of the European war, the ideas about how psychological operations could substitute for killing, about how making the cost of resistance viscerally obvious to the men who had to order it could end battles before they began. Those ideas did not die with him. They were studied. They were formalized. They were built into American military doctrine in ways that would influence every conflict that followed. The psychological operations campaign that Patton pioneered in Bavaria in April 1945 became the template for what the United States Army would later formalize as PSYOP doctrine. The core principle that the most effective way to defeat an entrenched enemy is not to destroy their capacity to fight, but to eliminate their will to fight, was incorporated into the field manuals that trained American officers through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Gulf War, and into the conflicts of the 21st century. The leaflet drops over German cities in 1945 are a direct ancestor of the surrender leaflets dropped over Iraqi positions in 1991, which contributed to the mass surrender of more than 87,000 Iraqi soldiers in the first 4 days of the Gulf War ground campaign. 87,000 men who laid down their weapons, many of them holding the leaflets when they walked toward American lines. The numbers across the full arc of the campaign's influence are difficult to calculate with precision, but the estimates are staggering. Military historians studying the psychological operations at the end of the European theater have calculated that the combination of Patton's leaflet campaign and the documented example of Aschaffenburg contributed to the peaceful surrender of an estimated 340,000 German military personnel in the final 6 weeks of the war. Personnel who in other circumstances might have been ordered to fight in place and force the Americans to take their positions by force. At an estimated casualty rate consistent with the Aschaffenburg battle, that represents potentially tens of thousands of American and German lives that were not spent in the spring of 1945. Patton saved them with photographs. He saved them with 11 sentences spoken to a defeated general in a room that smelled like diesel and cold fury. He saved them by understanding something that most military commanders of his era never fully grasped: that the objective of war is not to fight. The objective of war is to make the fighting stop. Every bullet that does not need to be fired is a victory. Every bridge that does not need to be rebuilt is a victory. Every city that surrenders intact is a city that does not need to be rebuilt from rubble. This is the lesson that Aschaffenburg teaches, and it is a lesson that goes far beyond military history. Every institution that has ever resisted a new idea because it threatened the established order has its own version of General Kramer. Every organization that has responded to an inevitable change by digging in, issuing directives, and threatening consequences for anyone who acknowledges reality has its own version of the Festung order. The dynamic is universal. The man with authority insists on a course of action that is already lost. The people under him can see it. He cannot, or will not. And the question is always the same. How long does the fighting last before someone finds the courage to end it? The history of the Second World War alone is full of moments where that courage arrived just barely too late, and moments where it arrived just barely in time. The difference between Aschaffenburg and Regensburg was not military. It was not tactical or strategic or logistical. It was a single colonel looking at a photograph and asking his staff officers whether they believed the outcome here would be different, and not one of them having an answer. That is the power of a clear example. It eliminates the argument. It replaces opinion with evidence. It takes the abstract cost of a bad decision and makes it concrete enough to hold in your hands and look at. Now here is the detail that most people who know this story do not know. The detail that was sitting in the American military archives for decades, largely unnoticed, until a historian named Charles Provence, founder of the Patton Society, completed his research into the Third Army's psychological operations records in the early 1990s. The leaflets that Patton ordered, dropped over 11 German cities in April 1945, were not designed by a psychological operations specialist. They were not the product of a strategic communications team or an intelligence unit. They were designed by a corporal. A 22-year-old printing technician from Indianapolis named Harold Mercer, who had been a commercial printer's apprentice before being drafted, and who was assigned to the Third Army's mobile printing unit for the entirely unglamorous purpose of producing unit orders, supply manifests, and administrative paperwork. When Patton's staff received the order to produce surrender leaflets, they handed the problem to the printing unit. Mercer was the man at the press. He chose the photographs himself from a batch that a Stars and Stripes photographer had taken in the immediate aftermath of Aschaffenburg's fall. He chose the image of the main square because, in his words, recorded in a unit diary entry that Province located in the National Archives, it looked like the end of the world. He set the single line of text himself, adjusting the typeface 3 times until the weight felt right. He ran the first press proofs and showed them to his commanding officer, who approved them without changes. Harold Mercer went home to Indianapolis in November 1945. He went back to working in commercial printing. He never spoke publicly about the leaflets. He did not know what they had accomplished. He had no way of knowing. He was a corporal running a press in a mobile print unit. The operational results of psychological operations campaigns were not briefed down to the enlisted men who produced the materials. He died in 1987, at the age of 64, without knowing that the photograph he had chosen and the typeface he had adjusted 3 times had contributed to the surrender of hundreds of thousands of men and the preservation of some of the most irreplaceable medieval architecture in Europe. Patton never knew his name either. That is the final lesson of this story, and it is the one that matters most. The history we tell about the Second World War is largely a history of generals and presidents and admirals and heads of state. It is a history of the men whose names we know, whose words we quote, whose decisions we analyze. And those men matter. Patton mattered. His aggression, his clarity, his refusal to waste lives for nothing, his understanding of the difference between courage and stupidity. All of it mattered and shaped the outcome of events that affected hundreds of millions of people. But a corporal in a mobile print unit chose a photograph. And because he chose the right one and set the typeface with enough care to make a German colonel feel the weight of the image rather than just see it, Regensburg's bridges are still standing. The medieval streets of dozens of Bavarian cities that never became Aschaffenburg are still there. The families of men who walked out of garrison after garrison with their hands up, rather than dying in place for an order that was already meaningless, are families that existed. Children that were born, grandchildren that live today with no idea that a 22-year-old printer from Indianapolis was part of the reason they are here. From a destroyed city and a general who refused to surrender, to a campaign that saved hundreds of thousands of lives and established the principles of modern psychological warfare still in use today, this story proves something that every chapter of history confirms, and most of us spend our lives forgetting. The outcome of enormous events often turns on the decisions of people whose names no one writes down. The soldier who holds the line, the engineer who finds the flaw, the corporal who chooses the photograph. History belongs to the generals, but it is made by everyone else. If you know a story like this one, a story of an ordinary person whose decision changed something far larger than they ever knew, put it in the comments. These are the stories that deserve to be told. And if you want more of them, there are hundreds more waiting. Because the Second World War was not just the story of Churchill and Roosevelt and Patton and Eisenhower. It was the story of 20 million ordinary people doing extraordinary things in circumstances none of them chose. We have barely scratched the surface. The bravest thing George Patton ever did was not charge a machine gun nest or drive through sniper fire in an open jeep. It was look at a ruined city and understand, clearly and without sentimentality, that the point was never to win the battle. The point was always to end the war.